I just finished a review copy of the new book Holy Hell, A Case Against Eternal Damnation by Derek Ryan Kubilus, or Kubilus. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. I apologize. Published by Erdmans, and thanks to Erdmans for sending me this for review. This is my honest take on the book. I'll step you through my typical format of the research behind it, or the main idea of the book, the research behind it, the readability of its style, and then my general reaction to it. So let's get into it, to Holy Hell, which is a great title, by the way. But the main idea of this book is it's in the Christian Universalist stream of kind of talking about or reacting to the doctrine of hell. But there's a little bit of a wrinkle to this one, or a nuance to this one, which was part of why I was interested in it. He is defending what he calls kind of a purgatorial universalism, but within the Protestant tradition. So purgatorial doctrine most famously comes out of a lot of Catholic tradition and Catholic teaching, but he's defending it from a more Protestant angle. His background is Wesleyan Methodist. But yeah, so he's really refuting eternal damnation, eternal conscious torment damnation, but also defending a universalist ultimate reconciliation of all things, but with this purgatorial period in the afterlife. It's a really not totally unique. He's definitely not making this up whole cloth or unique, but it is a little bit of a wrinkle to some of the typical arguments that get pulled out when this doctrine is discussed. So yeah, that's what he's defending. I'll talk a little bit more about the way he defends it as I get through the rest of my areas of review here. But the research behind it, this is a very popular level style of book. So it's not hugely research-driven or research-based. It's not academic in kind of its style or structure. But it's also not without its research. I mean, he cites people like David Bentley Hart, which is not a big surprise in this conversation today. He also talks about some church history. He talks about John Wesley and the Wesleyan tradition about talking about hell. He has one chapter that's more rooted in not exegesis per se, but a little bit of biblical linguistics and biblical languages, where he talks, I think, very helpfully about the history of the actual different terms that are used in the Greek New Testament, especially. And there's also a section on discussing the concept of Sheol in the Old Testament. There's really one chapter that really gets into that. That's probably the most biblical, exegetical, linguistic, research-oriented section of the book. So there is research there. He also does some, I think, helpful research in terms of current events, like current discourse and talking points when it comes to debating hell and the afterlife and whatnot. And so he cites those interviews or sermons or whatever talks that he talks about Mark Driscoll and Alistair Begg and some kind of evangelical voices, and sites where you can find the things that they talked about. So the research is there. It's not driving the project, but it's kind of supporting the project. And there's that one chapter that gets more into the biblical text and the kind of biblical history and cultural background of the scriptures. That's probably the most heavy quote-unquote research. So it's there. Okay, the style of it, the readability of it. This is a wonderfully readable book. It's very pastoral in tone, and I'll say a little bit more about that in my reaction in a minute. It's very gentle. It's very warm, I would say. It's written by someone who knows. I think he comes across as, he's a pastor by vocational career, and so I think he knows very well the kinds of people who are wrestling with these ideas and the fears that come with like letting go of traditions or considering new ideas, or the psychological difficulty barriers that people might have of changing their mind on some like traditional notions of hell. And so he keeps that in mind as he makes his case, and he argues, I think, very pastorally. He's very confident, so it's not like he's wishy-washy, but he's also very gentle, and I appreciated that. And he also uses a lot of very memorable images, anecdotes of his experiences, anecdotes of conversations he's had with people over his pastoral career, and all of that just suffuses kind of the whole book. It's very that's probably one of my biggest takeaways from it, is that it's very warm and inviting, and not overly polemic or argumentative or fierce, which I'll say more about that in a second as compared to some other writers. You may be understanding who I'm thinking about as I say that. But that's one thing that sets this book apart, is its warm style, I would say, readability. And then finally, my reaction to this book. I liked this book. I appreciated this book. I was very intrigued by his Protestant purgatorial universalist approach. And when it comes to the conversation about hell, the afterlife, universalism, purgatory, all of that stuff, there are different ways that people get at this, and there's a spectrum of kind of polemics. And I was thinking of David Bentley Hart when I chuckled a minute ago. I love David Bentley Hart, as I've talked about on this channel. I absolutely love his books. But one, I think, at times very valid criticism of him is his rhetoric and his uncompromising, it's what I love about his style, but it's also the thing that pushes a lot of people away, and particularly in his book on universalism, That All Shall Be Saved, which I've reviewed on this channel. I think that is a valid criticism that could be brought at times, at least of the style. It's not a criticism of the substance of his arguments, but it's the criticism of the style and the method by which he makes his arguments. And then also there's a lot of polemics on the other side, people clapping back to people like David Bentley Hart. So there's a lot of sharp and fierce back and forth in this topic in particular. And this book, Holy Hell, does not, despite its somewhat provocative title, it just is not that style whatsoever. This is like sitting with a wise, gentle, caring pastoral figure who is just presenting you with this idea and giving you some ways to think about it that you may not have heard before, and encouraging you that it's okay to think about it. And he brings, when needed, that research of the biblical text, like I mentioned a minute ago. He's not just kind of waxing on his own ideas without any sort of research or any sort of understanding of the history behind the reception of these ideas over the course of Christian orthodoxy. So that's where this book fits in, and I think this would be an easier recommendation to someone who might be put off by the sharper rhetoric on the other side that I talked about. This would be a much easier recommendation. It's also very short and very easy to read, just in style and in vocabulary and in approach. So I think this is where that book really slots into this whole kind of conversation. It feels like there's a big conversation happening in publishing and writing and speaking right now in Protestantism and evangelicalism about considering, does Christian universalism have a place at the table? And this book definitely is obviously arguing for that, but it's doing it in a very gentle pastoral tone and in a way that I appreciated. Last thing I want to say about my reaction to this book is there's kind of a way that different people get at. I already talked about this a little bit, but there's different kind of ways people get at this. That some people do only biblical exegetical argument. They just stick straight to that. I think about someone like a Preston Sprinkle figure who's very, very, very sharply concerned about just what does the text say, and goes strictly down that lane. There's other people who get at it from more of a philosophical lane, like abstract, more esoteric philosophical reasoning, looking at the history of philosophy. I would say David Bentley Hart is a more primarily philosophical arguer, for example, although he's very biblically informed as well. But yeah, I'm just trying to make some specific kind of lanes that I see: biblical text, philosophizing, and then there's this other lane. None of these are completely clearly separable from each other, but there's a third lane that I would say is a moral intuition lane, where people are just trying to explore and this bleeds into the philosophy very clearly, but I think when you're trying to pay attention to more of a phenomenological moral intuition, what do we mean when we talk about goodness and love and justice and reconciliation, and then really capitalizing on that aspect of the afterlife and what does life look like after death and the eternal destiny of souls and all of that. I think that this book fits much more in the moral intuition lane, which fits in with the style of the pastoral approach and the gentle considerations and even some of the humor and all of that stuff. So I think the reason I lay out those lanes is because you can find books that capitalize on each of those in this whole conversation about universalism and hell and eternal destiny of people. And depending on the type of person, the way that they think, they might resonate with a book in each of those lanes more than others. And this one, I think, fits in that moral intuition, it's then suffused by some research and some certainly pastoral experience. So if you are a person who gravitates toward that style of argumentation, or you know someone who might be considering these ideas, I think this book is a really good recommendation for them to consider maybe a broader tradition within small O Christian orthodoxy around the globe and certainly over the centuries. Yeah, those are my thoughts on Holy Hell, A Case Against Eternal Damnation by Derek Ryan Kubilus. Thank you, Erdmans. Thank you, Pastor Derek for writing this book and putting it out into the world.